David Carter, a middle-aged man of color, well-dressed in a dark suit, is driving a luxury SUV on a deserted road. Jazz music sounded softly in the car, creating a peaceful atmosphere. David's eyes focused on the path, his face exuding confidence and calmness, like a person accustomed to great responsibilities. The whistle suddenly sounded. The rearview mirror reflects flashing lights from the patrol car behind. David frowned, surprised but not too surprised. He slowed down, pulled over to the side of the road, turned off the music, and let out a deep breath as if preparing for an unexpected conversation. His eyes were sharp, but there was a hint of caution, a natural reflex that had been etched in him after years of working in a prejudiced environment. Blake Thompson, a white police officer, got out of the patrol car in a somewhat overbearing manner. His hand rested slightly on the gun belt. His gaze swept over the shiny car before stopping on David's face. When Blake knocked on the car window with his eyes searching, David lowered the window and smiled politely but cautiously. "Where are you driving this car? Is this your car?" Blake questioned. "Excuse me, what's wrong, officer? Did I violate anything?" "Calm, David." Blake paused for a moment, squinting at David as if judging his every gesture. This brief silence made the air in the car seem to thicken. David gripped the steering wheel not out of fear, but because he recognized Blake's attitude, an unfounded suspicion, as if someone like David shouldn't own this expensive car. "Where are the car documents? I want to see it right away." Blake harshly. David breathed slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He had long since learned to deal with these situations. Calmness was his weapon. He slowly took his wallet from his pocket, pulled out his car papers and driver's license. All of David's actions are slow, deliberate, to avoid any moves that may be misunderstood. When Blake held the paper in his hand, his eyes didn't seem to focus on the content but turned to David. Contempt and scrutiny cannot be concealed. "An expensive car like this? What are you doing?" "I work in public service." "Is there a problem with this car, officer?" David's answer was a slight challenge, making Blake frown, his lips pursed. In that moment, the tension between the two rose markedly. David realized that he was not simply stopped for traffic reasons. For Blake, this is not an ordinary test but an assertion of power and bias. Blake stood up straight. His hand gripped David's papers, and his eyes couldn't hide his hostility. "Don't be too clever, man. Maybe I need to take a closer look at this car." In the car, David squeezed the steering wheel, but his expression remained as calm as before. Inside him, a feeling of resentment was simmering, but he didn't let it flare up. With the experience of someone who has faced a series of unfair situations, he understands that just one impulse can lead to a worse outcome. "I have provided all valid documents. What else does the officer want?" This sentence is a gentle reminder but also full of weight. It shows the confidence and steadfastness of David, who is not easily succumbed to unreasonable imposition. Meanwhile, Blake looked at him, his eyes flashing with a mixture of irritation and annoyance, as if his power had just been challenged. David Carter sat in the car, his eyes looking forward, his lips pursed into a restrained straight line. His hands were still lightly gripped on the steering wheel, but his knuckles were starting to turn white, a small sign that he was struggling to control his emotions. He was used to these situations, but familiarity never made it any less painful. Outside, Blake Thompson stood leaning lightly against the patrol car, David's papers clasped tightly in his hands. He frowned, looked down at the information on the driver's license and car registration, and glanced at David again. A suspicious gaze swept over the calm face of the man sitting inside the sleek SUV, as if trying to find some invisible hole to cling to. Blake muttered in frustration, his lips curled up uncomfortably. For Blake, the appearance of David, a man of color driving an expensive car, was like a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit in the picture he had drawn in his head. The deep-seated prejudices led Blake to see David not as an ordinary person but as a suspicion that needed to be verified. Blake returned to David's car, tapping the window with his fingertips. "You said to do public service, right? What is it specifically?" David stared straight at the officer through the open glass door, his eyes sharp but still surprisingly calm. He knew this question had nothing to do with traffic violations. It was a test, a gratuitous digging to confirm Blake's prejudices. A silent resentment surged in his heart, but experience helped him keep his tone soft. I am a lawyer. I work at the Harris and Associates Law Office in the city. Blake paused for a moment, as if surprised by the answer. His gaze changed, from probing to confusion for a moment, but then quickly returned to his inherent rigidity. For Blake, this information only made him more uncomfortable. Part of him didn't want to believe that David, a man like him, could be so successful. Blake smiled faintly, but the smile was not at all goodwill. Lawyer? Good for you. I must be very good at protecting your rights, right? David understood the meaning behind that statement. His eyes gleamed with coldness, but he still suppressed his emotions, keeping himself from slipping into the provocative trap. He's seen too many situations like this, when self-esteem is challenged by prejudice and implicit insults. David took a deep breath, keeping his voice slow and calm like someone who knew the rules of the game. I have provided all valid documents. If there's no good reason to keep me, I think I can go. Blake stared at David, his face swollen for a moment. David's confidence and steadfastness shook the initiative that Blake was trying to hold. His sense of power seemed to be being taken away, something Blake didn't easily accept. Blake picked up the radio, pretending to call to verify more information, but it was actually to prolong the situation. He was looking for an excuse not to admit that he didn't find any fault. Blake's slow and deliberately prolonged movements did not pass David's eyes. He squeezed the steering wheel slightly, his eyes fixed in silence. In David's heart, an underground wave was surging, anger, frustration, and pain for injustice over and over again. But he knew he couldn't let his emotions run out. He just looked directly at Blake, his eyes as sharp as a knife, sending a wordless message. I know what you're doing, and I will not succumb. The screen faded, leaving a contrasting image between Blake, a police officer standing against the car with a rigid and irritated appearance, and David sitting in the car, calm but no less resolute. Blake Thompson straightened up, his pale blue eyes gleaming with coldness as he stared at David through the car window. He felt that his control was being threatened, and that made the discomfort in his heart flare up even more violently. Part of Blake couldn't stand the fact that someone like David, a man of color, confident and educated, could dare to challenge his authority. Lawyer! That thought sounded in Blake's mind like a mockery. The way David spoke, calm but sharp, made Blake feel belittled. His ego, built on his self-esteem and position as a police officer, is now like a ticking bomb. Blake approached the car, one hand resting on his waist where the handcuffs and flashlight were dangling, adding to the wordless threat. This action had a clear purpose: to force David to make concessions. Do you think you can be loud just because you're a lawyer? Sit back and cooperate. I have the right to verify everything if in doubt. David suppressed a sigh. His restraint was like a string that was stretched to the limit. He looked straight at Blake, not evasive. His gaze was not filled with fear or humility, but instead with deep depression and disappointment. For David, the situation has gone from an ordinary test to a test of dignity. Policeman, you have my papers. Everything is valid. What is the real reason for keeping me? Blake twitched the corners of his lips slightly, forming an ironic smile. In his heart, he felt cornered. David was trying to push him to his limits, and Blake knew it. But instead of admitting, he decides to squeeze control like a wounded beast trying to appear aggressive. The reason is that I see that you have acted suspiciously. A person like you driving this car in the middle of the night? Don't you think that's weird? That sentence hit the air, cold and heavy. David felt his chest tighten, but he kept his expression. Words like, a man like you, were not the first time he had heard them. It is an illusion, an implicit accusation, and a clear demonstration of prejudice that is exposed. David clenched the steering wheel, his eyes still on the officer. In his mind now is not only anger, but also exhaustion and pain in the face of what he has experienced for decades. He said, doubtful, but did not give a good reason. I know my rights. If there's nothing left to discuss, Return the papers and let me go. Blake paused for a beat. His eyes flashed with confusion, but he immediately dismissed that feeling. Hurt self-esteem pushed Blake to stiffen, as if someone was fiercely defending something that he himself could not explain clearly. Blake took a step back, his voice full of menace. Do you want to make it difficult? Okay, I'll call for support from the department. We'll see how long you can be hard. David let out a breath, looking at Blake with sharp but calm eyes. Deep down, he understood that Blake was using power as a weapon to hide his insecurities. All of Blake's actions no longer involve procedures or suspicions. It's just a power play. The screen faded, leaving an image of Blake walking towards the patrol car, speaking into the walkie-talkie, glancing at David as if he had just won a game. In the car, David closed his eyes for a moment, his hands slightly removed from the steering wheel, as if to remind himself to continue to restrain. He knew it wouldn't be the last, and that's what made his heart heavy. The space seemed to thicken as David sat still in the car, his eyes staring straight ahead. In his heart, a simmering anger was waiting to erupt, but he suppressed it. He was too used to power games like this. With the experience of a veteran lawyer, he clearly understands that every word, every action at this time can be twisted against him. Outside, Blake was standing next to the patrol car, holding the walkie-talkie to his mouth. The words exchanged over the loudspeaker were brief, but his eyes kept panning towards David with challenge and vigilance. Blake couldn't let himself lose in this situation. He both felt degraded by David before and felt his self-esteem as a police officer under threat. In Blake's mind, thoughts swirled into the idea that David was challenging his authority. Blake walked closer to the car. Get out of the car. I'm going to need a search to make sure there's nothing unusual here. David took a deep breath, then slowly turned his head to look at Blake through the half-lowered car window. He kept a calm expression. His voice was deep and firm, but he couldn't hide his frustration. You don't have a search warrant, and you don't have any legal basis to do so. I know my rights. David's words were like a blow to Blake's self-esteem. A moment of confusion flashed in his eyes, but Blake immediately brushed it aside, his eyebrows furrowed with tension. Deep down, he knew David was right, but David's correctness only made Blake more impatient. He stuck between following the law and protecting his self-esteem. Blake slapped his hand lightly on the roof of the car as an act of power, and his voice became even colder. I advise you to cooperate. Don't complicate things further. David shook his head slowly, remaining calm, but his sharp gaze fell on Blake as if he wanted to penetrate his intent. This was no longer an ordinary conversation. This was a battle of minds, a confrontation between power and justice. You stopped me for no good reason. Now he wants to go beyond his authority again. I will not allow that to happen. If you continue to coerce, I will consider suing you for abuse of power. Every word of David seemed to add fuel to the fire in Blake's heart. He felt like he was cornered, as if David was in complete control of the situation. For Blake, this was unacceptable. He's the one with the power, the one who controls everything, and he can't let David snatch that. Blake narrowed his eyes, his voice hissing through his teeth. I'll give you another chance. Get out of the car, immediately. Inside the car, David looked directly at Blake, his palms clenched into the steering wheel. Not out of fear, but because he was struggling to keep himself calm. He's seen too many cases like this in his career, but that doesn't make them any worse. If you don't stop right away, I'll call your superiors and bring this to light. My right is not something you can trample on arbitrarily. David's words made the atmosphere suffocatingly tense. Blake stood silent for a moment, as if considering his next move. The confusion in Blake's heart began to grow, partly because he knew David was right, and partly because he didn't know what to do next without pushing the limits. The screen slows down to Blake's face. His gaze is filled with the contradiction between anger, self-esteem, and helplessness. Finally, he took a few steps back, throwing an angry gaze at David, but said nothing more. In the car, David took a deep breath, his hand relaxed from the steering wheel. He had just won a small victory, But the cost was mental exhaustion in the face of injustice once again. The final image is of Blake walking toward his patrol car, angrily slamming the door, while David sits quietly in the car, his eyes staring into the silent night, as if contemplating the persistent struggle he and others like him face every day. The space in the interrogation room seemed to fall into a heavy silence as David stared sharply at Blake. The small room with gray walls, the cold metal table reflecting the light of the pale yellow ceiling lamp made the atmosphere even more tense. Now it's just a waiting game, and David has the upper hand. On the table, a document was opened, and the contents seemed to be stripped naked. The photo, the report, and some detailed notes exposed the indisputable truth. Blake had exceeded his authority and abused his power toward David. This document is an undeniable accusation. David lifted the photo from the document. His voice was calm but full of weight. Do you know what this means? All your actions have been recorded. Blake sat across from him, his shoulders stiff, his hands clenched on his thighs so tightly that his joints were white. His face, once full of confidence and authority, was now distorted by a series of intertwined emotions: shock, shame, and anger. In Blake's mind, everything was like a wave of rage. The self-defense arguments, the justifications, had no place to cling to. Blake tried to keep his voice calm, but there was obviously a little trembling. You are trying to turn the situation around. This document doesn't make any sense at all. David interrupted, not letting Blake finish his sentence. His eyes were sharp as a knife, full of determination. Don't deceive yourself anymore. Both he and I knew he was wrong. This is not just an unprovoked stop, this is a deliberate abuse of power. And I'm not going to let this slip into oblivion. David's words echoed in the room like an indictment. With no way to argue, Blake swallowed dryly, his face flushed with shame and anger. His eyes glared at David, but the gaze was no longer powerful. It was just the weakness of a man who was cornered. Blake's psychology began to crack. The truth was all too clear, but his self-esteem and pride made it impossible for him to admit his mistakes. Blake slammed the table, as a way to release the anger in his heart. You don't have the right to judge me. Who do you think you are better than? Is it just because you're a lawyer? But Blake's words didn't shake David. He just sat there, silently looking at him like an adult watching a child's outburst of anger. David shrugged his shoulders slightly, exhaling a long breath as if he was too used to this situation. You should stop before you embarrass yourself further. His anger could not change the truth. The truth is, you abused your power, and now you are responsible for it. Blake leaned back in his chair, his whole body drooping. The feeling of failure and humiliation is pent up in every breath. A long silence filled the room, while David remained still, maintaining absolute calm. He understood that this victory was not a joy, but a testament to the justice he had always pursued. Finally, Blake lowered his head, his eyes blank as if he was aware of his situation. Without saying a word, the way he kept silent said it all. He knew he had lost, not only in this confrontation, but also in the battle between power and truth. David looked at Blake one last time before standing up, collapsing the document on the table. He left one last sentence, his voice deep but full of power. Justice sometimes comes late, but it always comes. And today it won. The sound of David's footsteps echoed in the room as he left, leaving Blake to sit alone in the heavy and silent atmosphere. The camera slowly receded, recording the image of a man who was once proud of his power is now sinking into disintegration, facing the consequences of his own actions. The press conference room was crowded with people. The dense microphones on the podium were like hundreds of eyes pointing at David, waiting for every word he was about to say. Media, journalists, and representatives from various civil rights organizations were present, creating an atmosphere of tension and anticipation. Flashes flashed continuously, shining on the resolute face of David, who was in the middle of a war not only with an individual but with an unjust system. David took a deep breath before starting. In his eyes, the fatigue after the long days of fighting was still visible, but there was a spark of determination and righteousness. He put his hand on the platform, and his voice was deep but strong, and it sounded clear throughout the room. We all know that my case is just the tip of the iceberg. A person like me can come to light and struggle, but how many others, those who have no voice, who do not have the conditions to defend themselves, have been suffering this injustice every day? The whole auditorium was silent. People listened not only with their ears, but with their heavy hearts. David glanced at the crowd, his eyes pausing at the journalists who were constantly taking notes and the suspicious gazes of the officials behind him. He continued word by word as if smashing into space. Our legal system, a system built to protect justice, is being abused. Power has been given to unworthy people, and they use it to oppress others instead of protecting them. Today, we are not just talking about a single incident. We have to talk about a systemic problem. At the bottom, a few reporters nodded, sometimes squinting at each other as if they had found a big story to exploit. Meanwhile, some others frowned, visibly uneasy. David's words touched on an unswallowable truth. At the back of the room, Blake stood quietly in the dark, listening to every word David say as if every knife was swirling at his self-esteem. His face sank, his lips pursed. There was no trace of his former arrogance. David paused for a beat, his hands clenched into fists and then let go, as if trying to suppress the anger inside. He looked directly into the camera lens, where he knew ordinary people would see his message. We have to change. It is impossible to just let a few people fall down and walk over as if nothing happened. We need to be held accountable, from the police to the lawyers to the legislators. Otherwise, we will lose the trust of the people we are obligated to protect. Whispers began to emerge in the room. A reporter stood up and asked, a sharp voice, "Are you accusing the entire legal system of being unfair? Are you saying that all law enforcers abuse power?" David turned to the reporter, his eyes steadfast but unwavering. "I don't say everything, but a good system won't protect the bad guys. A good system will admit the mistake and correct it. True law enforcers will not cover up the wrongdoer. We need reform, and we need it immediately." As soon as he finished speaking, the room fell silent, and then quickly exploded with the sound of cameras shooting continuously and the sound of rattling keyboard typing. The image of David standing there alone but not subdued became the focal point. In the hearts of those present, a new consciousness began to rekindle. This fight was not only his own, but that of all those who were hungry for justice. In the distance, a woman, a representative of a human rights organization, smiled slightly, her eyes shining with hope, and Blake, standing in a hidden corner, could only look down at the floor in silence, as if realizing that the storm David had just started would last longer and change many things. David stepped back, bowed to the auditorium, and walked out of the podium. The applause rang out sporadically at first, then quickly spread throughout the room. He didn't go back, he didn't need to look at who was supporting him because he knew that this was a long journey, but this was the most important first step. The afternoon slowly descends on the city, and the sunset casts a pale orange over the streets and buildings. In David's small living room, the atmosphere was strangely peaceful. The sound of birds outside the window blended into the ticking of the clock, as if all the previous chaos was only a distant memory. David sat on the old recliner, his eyes looking out the window. The frayed suit he wore was still there, as a vestige of the war that had lasted for days. On the opposite side, his son, Ethan, sat curled up on the sofa. The 15-year-old's eyes were filled with reflection, things that were far beyond his age. On the table, a cup of tea had cooled down, and the steam had long since stopped rising. David lowered his gaze to Ethan, his voice deep and slow. "Ethan, you've probably seen what I've been through these days. I want you to understand one thing. Sometimes standing up for what's right can be lonely, and it's not easy." Ethan raised his head, his eyes glittering incomprehensibly. All this time, he has watched his father become the focus of public opinion, facing criticism and threats. He had seen his father come home every night, tired, his eyes red from insomnia, but the next morning he got up and walked on. Ethan stammered, his voice soft, "But Is it worth it, Father? Sometimes I was afraid. I am afraid that people will harm me. And then, they won't change anything. Ethan's words were like a knife swirling in David's heart. But he didn't blame his son. David understands Ethan's fear, the fear of a child who has just touched the dark side of this world. He sighed, his hands clenched tightly on his thighs. After a moment's hesitation, David said, "Whether it's worth it or not, only time will tell. But if you don't do it, who will? If we were all silent, what would change?" Ethan lowered his head, his eyebrows furrowed. He was silent, thinking about his father's words. David stood up and walked up to him, placing a firm hand on his son's shoulder. His voice was deep, but he couldn't hide his seriousness. People often think that power lies in power, but that's not the case. The real strength lies in courage, the courage to fight, the courage to defend what is right, and sometimes the courage to believe that you will not fight in vain. Those words made Ethan look up at his father again. In David's eyes, Ethan no longer saw a tired man, but a warrior who could not fall. A father has carried enormous pressures on his shoulders but remains as steadfast as a rock in the midst of a wave of evil. David continued, his eyes full of sincerity. "There will be days when I feel helpless, Ethan. There will be times when people will ridicule you, saying that your efforts are in vain. But don't let them make you forget why you started. The world only changes when someone dares to stand up, even if it's just one person." Ethan looked at his father for a long time, then nodded slowly. In his heart, doubts and fears gradually dissipated, giving way to a new belief. It was a belief in righteousness, in the courage that his father had just passed on. Ethan understands that no matter how cruel the world is, change always starts with the smallest actions, from people who are willing to stand up even with empty hands. David smiled slightly, his eyes gleaming with a rare relief. Eventually, he was able to pass on the biggest lesson of his life to his son, a lesson he believed Ethan would carry with him for the rest of his life. The room was quiet again, but the atmosphere was different. Outside the window, the sun had set completely, giving way to the deep night sky. Ethan looked out as if he had just seen the world in a new way, where he understood he would have a responsibility to protect what was right. In the distance, car horns sounded in the street, but in David and Ethan's hearts, peace was restored. A week after the high-profile lawsuit and the waves of public opinion, David stepped onto the podium to speak at a small but packed community center. Neon lights hanging from the ceiling shined faintly, shining down on crowds of all ethnicities, ages, and backgrounds. They sat close to each other, their eyes fixed on David, the man who dared to stand up when they all chose to remain silent. David adjusted the microphone in front of him, taking a deep breath to dispel the feeling of tension that still lingered in his heart. This wasn't the first time he had spoken in public, but today was different. Today, he speaks not only as a victim of injustice, but also as an inspiration for change. In the front row, his son, Ethan, watched quietly. The 15-year-old boy sat up straight, his eyes wide open and more attentive than ever. Ethan had seen his father sweat and shed tears in the past few days, but he also noticed the steadiness in his eyes. At this moment, Ethan knew his father was not only speaking for himself, but also for everyone who was here. David raised his voice, warm and full of energy. "I was there. A seemingly normal car stop changed my life. I was accused of something I didn't do. But the worst thing is not the accusation. It's the moment I realize I'm not the only one." The crowd fell silent. His quotes are not cliches. They carry the weight of truth and experience. David continued. His gaze swept over the worried faces below. "We can be angry. We may feel helpless. But what matters is what we do with that anger. Shall we let it burn us, or turn it into a fire to light the way?" At the far end of the room, a middle-aged woman nodded slightly. A group of young men whispered to each other, their expressions becoming more serious. That's when David knew. His words had begun to creep into their hearts. He paused for a beat. His hand involuntarily gripped the edge of the podium as if to give himself more strength. His voice became firmer as he continued. "I can't change what happened to me. but I can change what happens next. I chose to stand up, choose to turn my pain into a wake-up call. And today I urge you, the people sitting here, to do the same. None of us should tolerate injustice in silence anymore. In the front row, Ethan swallowed dryly, his eyes lit up. In his heart, a strong emotion surged, a deep pride and admiration for his father. Ethan understood that he was turning the scariest moment of his life into something bigger, more meaningful. The crowd began to stir, and a few people stood up and clapped slowly. The applause grew louder and louder, until it merged into a long, resounding applause. Some people wiped their tears, some looked at each other determinedly. They know they are no longer alone. David looked down at the crowd, his eyes shining with emotion. For the first time in recent weeks, he felt he no longer had to fight alone. He lit a fire, small but enough to spread. As the applause subsided, David ended his speech with a powerful appeal. Remember that change doesn't come overnight. It takes patience, courage, and solidarity on the part of all of us. Today, we start not just for ourselves, but for the next generation. David looked at Ethan, and both father and son smiled at each other. It was an understanding, hopeful smile. Ethan knew he would be a part of that change, and his father had just laid the first brick for a new path. The next day, when a video of David's speech went viral on social media, no one could have imagined that his life would change forever. The nearly 10-minute clip, recorded during the speech at the community center, quickly broke through geographical barriers and attracted millions of views in just a few hours. For David, it was a powerful shock, an admission he had never imagined. He sat in front of a computer screen, his hands shaking slightly as he saw his name repeatedly appear in news headlines, accompanied by the caption, "David, the man who stood up for justice." David's mood at this time was very complicated. Part of him felt as if he had just stepped out of a heavy rain and was now standing in the sun, but the rest was full of anxiety. He is not just a narrator of his own story anymore. He has become a symbol of struggle and justice, and with that comes an invisible but heavy responsibility. Have I come this far? It's not just about me anymore. It's about all those who have endured injustice. What should I do next? Not long after, Ethan walked into the room. He had watched the video, and now he clearly felt the change in his father. He saw that his father was less talkative. His eyes were a little distant, as if he was lost in thought. But Ethan understood that it was because David knew that from here on, he would have to face many new challenges. "Dad, I saw the video. Everyone talks about Dad. How do you feel?" David did not immediately reply. He sat down, rubbed his hands on his forehead, and muttered, "It feels like a storm is coming to me. But I am not in the middle of a storm. Body, I have to stand firm to set an example for others. It's not just my story anymore. It's that of a whole generation." David took a deep breath, then turned to his son, his eyes full of determination. "Ethan, this is not going to end here. We need to do more. We need to change the system." In the days that followed, David's popularity did not stop at a video or a personal story. Social organizations began contacting him, inviting him to participate in seminars and speeches about the system of injustice in the police and the law. The video became not only a touching personal story, but also a flame that ignited the movement for justice. Hashtags such as #JusticeForDavid, #EndSystemicRacism, #StandUpForJustice spread like a wave, attracting the attention of millions of people. David senses the change in society. Thousands of comments on social media call him a hero, but besides that, there are controversial opinions. Some see him as a justice fighter, while others argue that he is only taking advantage of his personal affairs to achieve political ends. With each passing day, David receives calls from reporters, journalists, and NGOs. However, David did not let these overshadow his mission. He knew that this journey would not be easy, and that public attention was just the beginning. One evening, while having dinner with his family, David shared with Ethan and his wife Anna, "Everyone has noticed, but we have to be prepared for the next challenge. The real changes don't come from speeches or viral videos. It needs a new system, and we have to work with those in power to make that difference." Anna nodded, realizing that he was talking about the hard work ahead. But she also understands that with growing support, the opportunity to push for reform is clearer than ever. Ethan sat still feeling the seriousness of his father's words. Not only did he see the father in the famous video, but he also saw a man with a tireless fighting spirit. David's sudden fame didn't just stop at a small scale, but became part of the social revolution. Politicians and civic organizations began proposing legal reforms on the issue of racism, while groups of protesters and action groups began pouring into the streets, carrying slogans such as "End racism in the justice system" and "Justice for all." David stands in the midst of these changes, knowing that he has become part of the wave of change, but also understands that the road ahead will not be easy. His action is not just a declaration of war on past injustices, but a call to action for all those who have been neglected by society. This is when he really felt the power of community cohesion. That night, after the interview had ended and the crowd had dispersed, David stood quietly in front of the window in his study, looking out into the hazy darkness of the city. The lights of the skyscrapers reflected in his eyes, but his mind was no longer there. His whole body was tired, but not because of the work or the questions that were asked in the interview. He felt another weight, an invisible burden on his shoulders, a change that he had begun but could not turn back. David sighed, then turned to face the table where the piles of documents and reports had not yet been processed. Small notes about upcoming seminars, meetings, all of them are part of a long-term strategy that he has worked so hard to build. But today it doesn't seem to matter anymore. He had a bigger goal, and that goal was not himself but the whole system. David said to himself, "I can't stop. It's time to act. If it's not me, then who?" This feeling has never been so clear. He is no longer on the sidelines of the justice debate. He is the one who lives in it, promoting the discussions and actions that people like him have long dreamed of. But it also means he faces tougher choices than ever before. David sat down in his chair, his mind spinning with thoughts. Although he had achieved a lot, he knew that the end goal was still far away. His political career, his social power, and the reforms he was fighting for could not be changed by a single decision or event. This is a long war, a journey that knows no end. This feeling, a combination of hope and anxiety, makes David seem unable to stop thinking about his next steps. Ethan, his son, entered the room without a sound, as if he knew exactly when his father needed his company the most. He didn't say anything, just quietly sat down on the chair opposite his father, looking into his eyes. Ethan knew that his father was hesitating, but he also understood that nothing could stop his determination. "Dad, I know what you're thinking. I've done a lot, but I can stop. I believe that someone will follow in my footsteps." David turned to look at his son, and in his eyes was the complexity of someone who was both tired, but also resilient. "Ethan, thank you. But this is a bigger story than we think. And if we don't do something, who will? I can rest for a while, but this work will never end. Don't you see? This system has been around for a long time, and it still hasn't changed. I can't just stand and watch." Ethan didn't answer, just nodded. He understood that no matter what his father said, his steadfastness had never changed. That's why David is at the forefront of this struggle. David got up, went to the window again, and looked into the distance. He wasn't a fan of the city's bright lights, but today, it's a symbol of hope, even if it's small. But it's something he has to strive for. Life is never easy. But if I don't commit, who will? The arduous days show no signs of ending, but David understands that he has begun a journey of no return. Every step he takes is not only for himself, but for all those who have been forgotten, for those who have no voice. And with that in mind, he turned to face his son, the determination in his eyes like a fire that never went out. "We will not stop. Ethan, we'll see that this fight will lead us to a better future."